Hi everybody, Professor King here. Today I'm going to be talking about Michel Foucault's The Perverse Implantation from a larger text called The History of Sexuality. So I know this one's a little bit challenging, so instead of belaboring any points, I'm just going to dive right into it and go over the PowerPoint as best I can. One thing I do want to say though, again, that I really want to stress with these readings, they're challenging. They are written in a language that most of us are not familiar with, and that's the language of theory. And even though that language of theory presents itself in a variety of different cultural languages, right? Like French or English or German, what have you, the language of theory, the definitions, the vocabulary, these things are new that we have to sort of familiarize ourselves with. And so, you may look at some of these theory essays and you may flip through the textbook, and say, oh, well, this is cool. This perverse implantation is only about, 6 or 7 pages and maybe a couple more on the history of Foucault. I can do this Sunday, right? No. You want to spend your time. The reason why I give you small readings of theory is because I want you to focus on them. I want you to grapple with them. I want you to go, what is this person saying? And even again, at the end, if you only understand 10% of that, that's okay. That's kind of like the point of a lot of introduction to theory. So I just want to remind you of all that because I know we're probably settling into the class, but still feeling that like that feeling of I have no idea what is going on here, and you are in like company. There's kind of an old saying among a lot of theory professors when they teach theory, they say like, heck, I don't even know what these people are saying all the time. And that should give you a little bit of comfort in that, theory is challenging. It's difficult to trudge through, but also in its sort of ambiguity and its perhaps like esoteric nature that is hard to just grab and know immediately, is this ability for interpretation that becomes so rich and so complex and so varied. So again, don't freak out if you don't understand every single word in Foucault. Nobody does, even if they speak French. It's more the ideas behind and really the implications of what Foucault is talking about. And we'll talk about that in a moment. And even Nietzsche and these other people that we'll be reading, right? At very least, if you feel like you're not getting any of this in class, at least at the end of the day, you can kind of go to, your friends or perhaps people you're dating or whatever and be like, well, Nietzsche says blah, 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 right? And then you can sound like really sophisticated and smart, if nothing else. So keep that in mind, but I'll take it to the share screen now and I'll take it to the PowerPoint and we'll talk Michel Foucault, okay? Blah, 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 slideshow. Yes, I got it, guys. Okay, play from start. All right, so you'll see subtitles on here. I also have, so you should see, if you don't see subtitles here, they also will be as, on YouTube and on Zoom. So, be aware of that. So we're talking about The Perverse Implantation by Michel Foucault. And this school of theory, actually Foucault deals with several schools of theory. Foucault's a Marxist, which does not mean what you think it means. It doesn't mean that he's like gonna, sell our secrets to the Russians or anything. They already did that a few years ago in our presidential election. Ooh, sick burn, Professor King, just kidding. No, so he's a Marxist, which means Marxists are really, what they're interested in is looking at capital, at material wealth, at labor, at how society functions to further those things, to further material and capital, how power sort of operates to do those things, and how, you know, how really people are subjugated in order to make those ends become realities. But also, this is an example of new historicism. That's the other thing that Foucault is known for throughout his work. So, you know, he's got Discipline and Punish, which is where he talks about the panopticon that was originally, you know, theorized by Jeremy Bentham, the guy who's now a wax figure. That's a story for another day. You know, and then the history of madness, where he kind of looks at Western, you know, he's a Westerner, so he's looking at Western approaches to these phenomena within given Western societies. So he's concerned with history, right? And with, you know, sort of looking at history in a different way. And that's at the heart of what new historicism does, right? Particularly when it applies to literature with people who at the bottom, you'll see I put Stephen Greenblatt. Stephen Greenblatt is like the granddaddy of new historicism as it pertains to literature. But it looks at history through the context of literature and culture. And clearly, because we're talking about historicity or history in general, we're talking about revisiting the past. And this time, you know, usually we're looking at voices that had not been heard before. So marginalized voices, particularly, or just sort of a new way of looking at history that we hadn't considered previously. New historicism also seeks to unmask or expose historical networks and material practices. So for example, in this reading, we're going to see how the Industrial Revolution, how the advent of capitalism in Western society affected the way that we look at sexuality, which is crazy, right? Like, you don't really think of like, you know, unless you're going to like OnlyFans or something, you're not thinking about how capitalism is tied into sexuality. But really, what Foucault is arguing is like, you can't have the explosion of sexualities we've had in the last 150 years without you know, capitalism sort of changing the Western historical trajectory. And then finally, new historicism interrogates the presupposed static and monolithic nature of history. In other words, the history that we think we know, that we read in our textbooks in high school, people like Foucault and Greenblatt and so many others are reviewing history and saying, well, did it really happen that way? You know, like, was Andrew Jackson the wonderful guy that we all purport him to be if he was responsible for the genocide of the Native Americans and he contributed to the genocide of African Americans? Does he deserve to sort of have that legacy that he has, or do we need to revisit some of these things and look at, you know, his role in those genocides, and maybe, you know, look at him with a little more critical lens? That's just one example, right, of like interrogating history from what some people have called like the winner's perspective, right? I don't like to use that because it assumes like some sort of superiority of a particular voice over other voices, and that is just not, you know, that's delusional. But that's kind of what new historicism is seeking to push back against, right? Like, history is so much more complex than you know, a blurb or an encyclopedia entry, right? Like, let's look at the other voices that were involved. And one thing I want to say is like a really interesting example we can see like today is I don't know if any of you have heard of the 1619 Project. It's being sort of instituted by the New York Times and by these other media outlets. But the 1619 Project is another example of like new historicism in action, in that it's, you know, it's looking at American history from the lens of how essentially what we have in terms of, you know, this society would not exist had we not horrifically enslaved, tortured, brutalized, enacted what has never been seen as an official genocide, but clearly is an unofficially recognized genocide in the way that we've historically treated African Americans since 1619, right? So it's a way of revisiting history from that lens. So if you're interested, check out the New York Times 1619 Project, because there's really fascinating stuff that comes out of there. All right, so let's talk Foucault, because this is what we're looking at in terms of the reading today. Just the basics to know about Foucault. What I would say is, if you ever want to read a biography of Foucault, I highly recommend it, because the guy was BANANAS, like in a good way, like not, you know, not knocking him, but he just lived a wild life. His main interests, as we see in books like The History of Madness, as we see in books like Discipline and Punish, as we see in The History of Sexuality, is he revisits the same themes, which are the relationship between power and subjugation, right? In other words, like power and the lack thereof, the distance from power that some of us can find ourselves in, right? Within this discussion, he was particularly interested in sort of the way that we treat the fringe elements, the illicit elements, and the criminal elements of our society. So, you know, in other words, if it's not acceptable, he was probably curious and or fascinated by it. And so today, the example we'll look at is how that happened in sexuality. But, you know, when he talks about the history of madness, he talks about how societies treated people with mental illness, you know, since the Enlightenment as you know, like needing to be locked up. And now if we look at the present day prison industrial complex, we see like so much of what Foucault is looking at, you know, I mean, he was looking at it in the 60s, but it happened a few hundred years ago. We see it kind of new iterations of it popping up. And, you know, that's the third kind of thing he's interested in, how these things kind of all work together, right? How we incarcerate, classify, and impose hyper-surveillance on these elements in society, on the fringe elements, on people with mental illness, on criminals, on, you know, people who are quote unquote sexually aberrant, right? Who have, you know, sort of non-traditional sexualities. And so that's what he's interested in. So, you know, we think about this stuff and we tend to think like with these touchy, taboo subject matters that the person's going to have like a really sort of like intense sentimental argument. And Foucault's argument, again, because he's a new historicist, his argument is going to have to deal with how the way that we thought about sexuality was not accurate. And so he's going to tell us what he, in his research, asterisk next to that, in his research, why we have our approach to sexuality that we do, you know, in the last 150 years or so. And one of the big ideas that Foucault he didn't come up with it, Jeremy Bentham came up with it, but he took Jeremy Bentham's idea and ran with it. This may be familiar to some of you, this image on the bottom, it's the panopticon. And, you know, it's a very long and, you know, complex text, but essentially the point of the panopticon is you have, you know, this is essentially like a prison, and think of it as like, it's like a circular structure, almost like a silo for housing prisoners. And in the middle of this silo is a smaller silo, is the guard tower. So the guards would, you know, the guards would sit in here, and the prison cells were set up in such a way, can't really see it, but they're set up in such a way to where the prisoners can't see the guards, but the guards can always see the prisoners. And so this panopticon has become a metaphor for so many things in our society, right? Where those who are exercising power against those who they're subjugating are doing so in a way in which, you know, those who are subjugated are not only vulnerable in the sense that they're incarcerated, right? That they're locked up, proverbially or literally, but also in that they can't, again, proverbially or literally see what the people who have power are doing. So again, this becomes a metaphor for any number of things. And we'll probably refer back to this in our reading, but it's just a good kind of thing to know in terms of Foucault's background. So let's go on to the text, okay? And we'll think about some premises that Foucault sets out early on in the text. If any of you are unclear on what a premise is, the premise is the thing that you put forth to ensure that you and your reader are on the same page to move forward with your argument, okay? So in other words, like if you think of like your old math classes, maybe you had lessons on if and then statements. The premise is kind of like the if part, right? Like if, you know, if it's raining outside, then I will be upset if I don't wear a raincoat, right? The if is the premise, right? It's the thing that we agree on. The then becomes the argument. But in other words, like in your background of your introduction, that's where you set up your premises when you're writing essays. Like you're letting your reader know, here are the things we need to know in order for me to further my argument, okay? So that's what a premise is. So here are some premises that Foucault sets up, right? The first is this idea of whether heterosexual sex is preferred because it encourages labor, and really it encourages more of a labor force. And not labor in terms of like, literally like I'm going into labor having a baby, although like that kind of is associated with it. But in the sense of, you know, if we're talking late 19th century Europe, let's say, right? How do we continue throughout history to create a labor force, to create, you know, the people who are going to do our work for us as a society? Well, we have to have people, right? And so if we're talking the end of the 1900s, right? Or I'm sorry, the end of the 1800s, the late 19th century, how do we achieve that workforce? Well, we need people to have babies, right? And so who can have babies in the late 19th century? Heterosexual people who have heterosexual sex, right? Like last I saw, at least at that point in history, before we had the, you know, technological innovations we've had today, those were the people who created other people who would eventually become part of the workforce, right? And so because of this, again, this is where he ties in that materialism, capital, right, to sexuality, right? So Foucault is saying like, because of this, and because of religion, right, the sort of very, very deeply embedded Judeo-Christian context that we're looking at, you know, Western Europe in, that combined with the need for a labor force is why we privilege heterosexual relationships, right? Why we've always privileged heterosexual marriage, because it means we're going to keep having people who will be part of the labor force. And this is where this notion of a dispersion of sexualities first comes into play in this reading. And essentially what Foucault says is a dispersion of sexualities creates or corresponds with multiple implantations of quote unquote perversions. So what do we mean by that? Well, think about it this way. I'm not asking any of you to share your personal section. I mean, like clearly you're watching a video. You don't have to tell me back anything, but I mean, we've all seen sex on television, on social media, in pornography, in real life, you know, And we've seen all the different gradations of sexuality, right? From hand-holding to kissing to the really gnarly stuff. And we've seen it across a wide spectrum of people, right? There's literally a sexual orientation spectrum that we can fall on, if it's homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality, asexuality, heterosexuality, right? Like, and there are so many more than those. Those are just a few. But think about it this way. If we know that people fall anywhere on that spectrum, and yet the norm that we accept is just heterosexual sex, then what that means is all these other guys that are naturally occurring in the world become perversions, right? And the further away they get from heterosexual sex, at least in the eye of the beholder, right, the more perverse they seem. And so where does this come from? Well, Foucault says there are two great Western systems, right, governing sex. One is the institution of marriage, clearly, right? Like, that is first, like the most obvious example of the privileging of heterosexuality historically up until very, very recently. And I would say even so recently that it was after Foucault died. He died in 1984. And then a sort of ordering of desires, meaning, again, like, not, like an ordering in a variety of different ways, right? Like, which desires are acceptable, which desires are not acceptable, which desires can be viewed in public, which desires have to be made private, which desires are totally benign and have nothing to do with sex, which desires are highly sexually charged, and again, everything in between. We start to order and classify those, right? Think like Nietzsche, this idea of classification that we take from Nietzsche is very present in some of this discussion in Foucault. So we have a few more premises before we get to the real zinger, right? So we talked about how marriage is privileged, right? So marriage rules for the rest of perversions had been until the 19th century governed by, let me fix that real quick. Wait a second. It's going to drive me crazy. There we go. All right. So until the 19th century, how do we regulate what is the norm and what isn't when it comes to sex in our society, when it comes to perversion in our society? Well, we create religious laws, right? Like, think of the 10 Commandments, like, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife. Well, unfortunately, that kind of treats women as property, but that's a rule that exists in a lot of people's minds as sort of dogma until to this day, right, and beyond. But that's canonical law, right? That's law governed by, the canon of the Bible, not the literary canon, but the biblical canon. Then we have the Christian pastoral, which governs marriage. And that has to do with, because religion is such a central part of most people's lives in the late 1800s, like, this is essentially talking about, like, people who go to their churches, who go to their religious communities and are counseled, right, by their pastor, by their particular sort of religious leader, and are told, like, what's kosher and what's not in terms of sexuality, right, or in terms of marriage. And then the last one is civil law. Like, we do have laws on the books that govern marriage, and frighteningly enough, we've had laws, certain laws on the books that said, like, that raping your wife was legal until the 1960s in a lot of states in America. So one thing that you want to think about in terms of Foucault is, like, Foucault is not concerned with whether laws are just, right? Foucault is concerned with how we use laws to enact power. So like clearly a law that says, you know, if you're married to her, you can rape your wife, like clearly with, you know, with the lens of today, and unfortunately the lens of today, like we should have seen that back then, we didn't, but clearly with the lens of today, we're saying, no, like you can't rape anyone. Like, that's not, it doesn't matter if it's your wife, it doesn't matter, you know, who it is, like that's not, you know, like, but that was a law. That was a law on, like I'm saying, you know, the law on a lot of books in America till very recently. And so that's an example of civil law governing marriage rules, right? If we see women as property vis-a-vis canonical law, right, then one thing we can do is treat them like property, right, and have our way with them sexually, right? Again, Foucault is not making a morality judgment like I am, because I think that's gross, right? Foucault is not, though. Foucault is just saying, here's how we govern sex, right? Here's how we regulate sex, or how we have historically. And another way we can think about this is like, I don't know if y'all remember Prop 8 in 2008. 2008 was when this was on the ballot. You know, the sort of, I forget what they even called it, but it was essentially, you know, a law saying that the only legally recognizable form of marriage is heterosexual marriage. And the people who were against that were essentially saying like, no, there are other forms of sexuality, right? Like, and we have to sort of consider that in terms of marriage. So that's another example of like civil law governing marriage, right? A very recent one. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, so Foucault talks about this discursive explosion that coincided with the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th century, right? So because of the Industrial Revolution, and this explosion of sexual discourses, or in other words, explosion of like ways that we can, you know, enact, behave, discuss, show, feel, think sex, right? Then what we see is less fixation on heterosexual monogamy and more emphasis on discretion. You even see this in literature. You see a lot of books, right? Madame Bovary, you know, Don Juan is the example that, and yes, it's pronounced Juan. I know, you know, anyone with half a brain knows it's Don Juan, but the pronunciation of it is actually Don Juan, oddly enough. You know, you start to see like these novels about people who are having these extramarital affairs. Whereas think back to like Samuel Johnson, right? That would have been a major problem if it weren't shown as like disgusting and aberrant and an abomination, right? So you start to see less fixation on monogamy, more emphasis on discretion, meaning like hide it. But you also see anything aberrant from heterosexual monogamy coming under scrutiny, right? And you see this like in the medical field, in the penal system, in other law institutions, in the way that the family is set up, and in the educational system. So like just one example of where we saw this, like where the medical field and the penal system, right, the punishment system, like the carceral system in our society, where we see this sort of interact is the homosexual conversion therapy, right? And I'm not talking about like the more contemporary stuff, which a lot of it sounds really frightening and like modern day torture. But the earlier stuff, the mid 20th century homosexual conversion therapy, where they would actually use actual shock therapy on people who were thought to be gay or people who disclosed that they were gay. They would use shock therapy on them. They would shock them. This is what you see here is like an ad for, and even says perversion, right? Like the thing that Foucault is talking about, right? Like, what is a homosexual? And, you know, it's very like, I mean, if you look at it now, you're just like, ugh. You know, but what this led to, what these sorts of advertisements led to was like, let's say, oh, I've got a son and I think he's, you know, not interested in girls. So I'm going to take him to this doctor, and this doctor is going to use this machine to physically shock, send voltage waves through the body of my son. Okay. So I just want to show that, like, you know, when we talk about power, right? Power can be, you know, our society, a lot of times the way it frames power is something very desirable, right? Something that we all want. But power can also be something that is torturous and violent and horrific and private and hidden, and all of these sorts of things, right? So, you know, this shock therapy that happened in the middle of the 20th century what Foucault says is a totally logical outcome to how we've been treating sexual difference, you know, as a result of the Industrial Revolution. He's not saying it's okay, but what he's saying is it totally makes sense that this fixation with anything that's not heterosexual sex will lead to something like shock therapy. Because if it's not the norm, if it's aberrant or an abomination in any way, right? What do we do with things that that don't fit into our conception of a model society? Well, we get rid of them, right? Or we hide them, we incarcerate them, we smash them to bits, right? We you know, we do all these sorts of things. We brainwash, we do all sorts of things, we indoctrinate to make sure that those elements, those undesirable elements, those perversions, that they at least cease to exist out in the open. So keep that in mind. So in terms of types of perversions, these things that are seen as perversions in Western society, according to Foucault. The first one he talks about is things that relate to children and sort of society's fixation on children and sex. And sometimes this is, you know, sometimes this is good. Like, we clearly don't want incest in our society, right? So like, that's something that we hyperfixate on in the hopes of getting rid of it, right? Some of you in your introductions talked about like the child sex trafficking, right? Like, that's not something we want. So like, clearly that's a thing that we want to address to make our society better. But, you know, if we're talking about 19th century society, right, we have things like, you know, childhood masturbation as a big no-no. And actually, if you look at this ad here, you may be going, why the heck is there an ad for cornflakes if you're talking about masturbation? Well, bringing back, you know, this idea of sex and capitalism, right? William Kellogg, the guy who created Kellogg's cornflakes, was convinced. I mean, he was sort of hyper obsessed with sexuality, and he thought it was very detrimental to you know, he thought it was essentially like hypersexuality, masturbation, sexual, you know, any sort of aberrant sexual proclivities were anathema to creating sort of like the perfect person, right? And so he was so obsessed with sort of suppressing sexuality, not just in himself, but in others, that he created cornflakes because, and I'm not making this up, he thought that bland foods were a way to suppress people's sexual desires. And so cornflakes, bland food, was the byproduct of that. And so that, you know, if you've ever eaten cornflakes, the guy who originally made those, you know, the recipe for those cornflakes you're eating, he did it because he didn't want anyone to masturbate. So there's the interesting thing you get to learn today. Okay, so another type of perversion, when we're looking at this 19th century industrial revolution explosion, is the fixation on homosexuality, right? What had been previously termed the sodomite, and again, that goes back to that canonical law sort of thing. Now in the 19th century, we see the homosexual, right? And Foucault talks about kind of like what the difference is. And the difference is a sodomite could have been, you know, someone who possessed any number of aberrant sexual proclivities. Whereas a homosexual, right, particularly the focus is on that person. And we can assume it's a man, right? Because, you know, society is just more obsessed with men and men's sexuality than they are women. At this time anyway. Foucault says that there starts to become this fixation with the homosexual. And he in fact says that, you know, the way that the homosexual is viewed in our society is that there's nothing about him, about his person, about his behavior, about who he is internally. There's nothing that when we look at that homosexual, we don't see as tying in directly to his homosexuality. And that, I mean, if we think about that, right, like that creates any number of, you know, identity classifications that we impose upon someone and that some people willfully embrace, right, just based on who they go to bed with at night or in the morning or whatever, or just who they're attracted to, right? So think about that for a little bit. And then third, the third types of perversions were any and all other wayward or unproductive sexualities. Again, the key word there being unproductive. And that has multiple meanings, right? Unproductive, literally in the sense that offspring cannot be produced, in the sense that if those offspring aren't produced, then we don't have people producing labor, right? And then we put that into like a personal, like your sexual desire is unproductive, right? Like then therefore you as an individual are somehow lacking or deficient, right? So we see that there's this relationship between pleasure and power, right? And not just sexual pleasure, but any and all pleasure, okay? So Foucault says a few different things, right? He says pleasure comes from exercising power, clearly, right? Like, you know, people who can thrust their power onto others, they get a satisfaction out of that, right? People who have privilege in our society or who have enough power to oppress others or just have enough privilege and power to ignore, right, the oppression of others, there's a pleasure in that. Even in the sense, if in just the sense that there's not that experience of pain at the hands of power, right? Which goes to the next quote, right? Pleasure kindles at having to evade this power, right? Power that lets itself be invaded by the pleasure it is pursuing, right? So in other words, like, you know, this fixation on classifying people's sexualities, on deciding whether or not those sexualities are acceptable or not, on deciding how to treat as a society those sexualities. That is an example of power letting itself being invaded by the pleasure it is pursuing, right? Because it's this interlocking, interrelated thing of like, I have this power I'm obsessed with sort of regulating these sexualities, but my power ceases to exist the second that hierarchy in which I am given the chance to focus on these sexualities goes away. And there's pleasure, or I'm sorry, there's the power asserting itself in the pleasure of showing off, right? So these things are interconnected. They're working in perpetual spirals, right? You can't have one without the other when we're talking about sexual discourses. And so that's a major head trip, right? Like, there's all kinds of pleasure and there's all kinds of ways of classifying and subjugating it. And they work together constantly, right? Think about that. Maybe we want to pause and think about that for a sec. But I'll move on. Where these do I have? Oh, we're on the last slide. Okay, so we go back to the discursive explosion of sexualities, right? Because of that discursive, again, that we talked about at the beginning, because of the discursive explosion of sexualities that happened in the late 19th century, coinciding with the Industrial Revolution, right? Pleasure and power reinforce one another through a complex network of discursive interactions. And these guys here are those discursive interactions, right? How we see them played out are some of these examples we've talked about, right? Therefore, power didn't repress sexuality. Rather, it created a proliferation of sexualities, okay? So think about this, right? When we talk about sex as it relates to power, the knee-jerk reaction of a lot of people is to say, power suppresses sexuality. But what Foucault's actually saying, which is kind of mind-blowing, is no, because power fixates on all the different types of sexualities, whether they're socially acceptable or not, particularly if they're not, right? But whether they are or not, because power fixates on those and chases them and pursues them and tries to do something, and, you know, the way that power looks at them changes over time. Instead of suppressing or repressing sexuality, right? Instead, now we're like, oh, there's all these kinds of sexualities, right? Like, so it's kind of like, well, that didn't do what we hoped, perhaps. But is that, you know, is that positive? Is that negative? Is that neutral, right? If it created a proliferation of sexualities, but the purpose was to somehow, you know, keep them down, what does that mean? So that is Foucault's Implantation of the Perverse in a nutshell. I know he's not the easiest guy to read. I'm not gonna, and I'll take it off the share screen now. I'm not gonna, you know, pretend like he's, you know, E.B. White and this is Charlotte's Web. But the ideas are cool. The ideas are worth it. You know, they make you start to think about maybe your own approach to these concepts and kind of how you see them playing out in everyday life and all that stuff. So I hope you enjoyed it. Any questions, always feel free to contact me, and I will see you in cyberspace. Okay, bye.